Hey all, Ron here from Military Images Magazine with a new episode of Life on the Civil War Research Trail. Today's story begins with this photograph. It's one that I added to my collection 10 years ago, and I bought it because I just liked it. None of the officers were identified, but I liked the way they were grouped together. There's some story lost in time behind it. Oh, I added it to my collection and just have enjoyed it. Now, a few years ago, I had an email from an individual who had seen a posting of the photograph and was able to identify them. In fact, he had found another print, a print of the same photograph, and on the back, the names were written, and they were written in such a way to be in order. And it appeared that the names, the order of the names, were a perfect match for each of the men as they were seated and standing. So I did a little bit of research, collected the names, and then let it sit for a little while and dug into it a little bit more very recently. And I discovered the man on the right is of particular interest. His name is Sanford Cobb Kellogg. Not a name that Civil War students would know, but I did what I normally do. I went and I found his record, and he served a 3-month stint with the 37th New York National Guard, or activated for federal service in 1862, and spent their time in the defenses of Baltimore. And then went back home. A year later, he joins the U.S. Volunteers as an aide to camp. Thought, well, that's kind of interesting. Set it aside and decided to go to ancestry.com to try to find out more about his genealogy. So I dug into his genealogy and I found him, his life dates and information about his family. And I began to dig around a little bit to see who was on the family tree. And I discovered his aunt, Frances. Well, they're all in Troy, New York. It's where Sanford grew up, and Aunt Frances did too. And in 1852, Aunt Frances married a West Point graduate, a man named George Henry Thomas. That's a name that you know, the incredibly talented general born in Virginia, remained loyal to the Union, a quiet man, unassuming, modest, winds up in a historic defense of the Union Army, Chickamauga, and he comes away with the nom de guerre, the Rock of Chickamauga. It's a great story, one of the most historic moments of the war in the West. General Thomas in command. Well, turns out that Kellogg was one of Thomas's aides during the battle. And in fact, there's an irony, a family irony connected to all of this. The way that Thomas got his name has something to do with Kellogg. So let me tell you the backstory. During the morning of that second day's fight, Confederate attacks are powerful, they're coordinated, and they're coming close to breaking Thomas's right flank, the lines of the right of the army. And Thomas does what a general does. He sends for help. He sends for reinforcement. He scatters his aides to find other divisions and brigades, whoever can pitch in. So Kellogg jumps on his horse and goes galloping off, and he finds Brigadier General John M. Brannan and his division. They're in line west of the Po Field about 10 o'clock, and he dutifully delivers his uncle George's request. And during this series of communications and consultations up the chain of command, Rosecrans finally gets involved, and Kellogg is there. And Kellogg remarks to Rosecrans that he noticed a gap in the Union line between General Brannan and another general, Joseph Reynolds. And Rosecrans acts quickly, and in hindsight, hastily. He orders the line to be, that gap to be plugged, getting some fresh troops in there. Well, the reality was Kellogg, his observation was incorrect. There really wasn't a gap. And so when Rosecrans gave that order to plug the gap, it was plugging a gap that didn't exist. And in fact, he formed a real gap, a real hole in the Union lines that the alert Confederates pretty quickly exploited. You students of the Civil War know the rest of the story. The Union Army became undone, began to collapse. And if it wasn't for General Thomas's actions to hold the fort, if you will, while large elements of the army were withdrawing all the way back to Chattanooga, the army of the Cumberland, the Union Army, might have been annihilated. It wasn't. It survived and it lived to fight another day. But that's another story. What happened here at Chickamauga and Kellogg's role in it is the irony. Of course, Kellogg can't be faulted for his observation. Neither can others along the chain of command, the various communications and consultations. This was a moving situation. Folks were doing the best that they could in the middle of a really difficult moment when those Confederates are bearing down on the Union Army and things are happening quickly. They're happening in real time. Of course, Rosecrans, in the end, he takes the fall for all this and he loses command to Thomas. Thomas, of course, gets that name, the Rock of Chickamauga. And so the connection between his aide, his nephew, Sanford Cobb Kellogg, and Rosecrans, and the almost annihilation of the Union Army are all interconnected. So just to be sure, you should know that Kellogg doesn't get any fault. The only one who was faulted is Rosecrans in the end. At least that's what we remember in history. Kellogg's service continues on to Nashville. Before that, he was in the Atlanta campaign. He receives a bunch of brevets or honorary ranks for Chattanooga, Atlanta, Nashville, one for his overall war service. He's a brevet colonel when it's all over. So Kellogg leaves with his reputation intact, and he goes on to join the U.S. Army, and goes on to a long career of decades. He serves in the infantry. He serves in the cavalry. He serves a 3-year stint as an aide to General Philip Henry Sheridan. And in fact, Kellogg's service extends all the way into the Spanish-American War. His last command is in Manila. He retires in the fall of 1898 and retires to Washington, D.C., and he dies 6 years later in 1904. His remains rest in Arlington National Cemetery. His most lasting legacy might be one that you and I can identify with because we could visit there anytime we wanted. He was one of the commissioners in the early 1890s, one of 3 commissioners who were responsible for helping to establish the Chickamauga and Chattanooga National Park. So there you have it, the story of Sanford Cobb Kellogg and Uncle George Thomas. So take care. We'll see you on the next episode.